Hello, friends. My name is JJ, and check this guy out. He is my Sede Vacante cookie. You see, I'm in Toronto right now, home of beloved Canadian fast food franchise Tim Hortons. And while I've been here, the Timmy's people were having this promotion where they were selling these smiley face cookies and smiley face cookie plushies, but only for a limited time, specifically April 28th to May 4th. So I bought one, and now I have a great souvenir of the Sede Vacante 2025 era. Sede Vacante is Latin for empty seat. In Catholic jargon, it means time with no pope. Sede Vacante 2025 accordingly lasted from the moment of the death of Pope Francis at 7:35 a.m. Vatican time on Monday, April 21st, to around 7:15 p.m. on Thursday, May 8th, when the new pope was formally proclaimed. It's common to think of human history in terms of the reigns of kings or queens or emperors or presidents. I myself am personally pretty fond of the Victorian and Showa eras, and given how long popes tend to be around for, they can be useful units for measuring historic eras as well. The reign of Pope Leo XIII, for instance, makes for a pretty good marker of the dawn of the modern era, in my mind. But what about times in which there is no pope at all? The Catholic Church is quite unique among the world's great hierarchical institutions in that they not only have a fair bit of downtime between leaders, but they actively celebrate and sentimentalize it as well. The Vatican City government released a special stamp for Sede Vacante 2025, for instance. It featured a painting of the sacred papal umbrella, which is the official symbol for a time with no pope. Church law requires the Sede Vacante period to last for a minimum of 16 days, so Sede Vacante 2025 wasn't a particularly long one, just 2 weeks and 3 days. And I was wondering, what was that era like? I mean, we all just finished living through it, so memories are still pretty fresh. So all the more reason to start sentimentalizing now. And that is what we are going to do today. Let us do a deep dive into this most recent Sede Vacante era and take a look at the news, the culture, the general vibe, because it's never too early to get nostalgic.
And this is a Fox News Alert. I'm Ashley Strohmeyer live from New York. Somber news from the Vatican, especially following Easter Sunday, with word of Pope Francis has died.
Pope Francis died on Easter Monday. It was an unusually late Easter, and the Pope died early in it. He was pronounced dead just an hour after sunrise, with the official cause of death said to be a stroke, followed by heart failure. At age 88, he was one of the oldest popes in the history of the Roman Catholic Church, but his reign had been about average length at almost exactly 12 years. Much was made of the fact that one of Francis's very last official duties was an Easter Sunday meeting with Vice President J.D. Vance. Given the apparent mutual antipathy between these two men, there were all of these memes about how Vance had either killed the Pope or the meeting had gone so poorly that Francis had decided he didn't want to live anymore. Over on this continent, most of us learned of the Pope's passing in the late evening. It was just 10:30 p.m. in my time zone, but for most other people, it was past midnight. It was obviously a huge news event and prompted a great deal of coverage and analysis in the media, mostly reflecting on the legacy of Francis's reign and the state of Catholicism in general. Pope Francis, I think it is fair to say, was broadly well-liked and respected around the world. He was seen as kind and unpretentious and gentle of spirit and word. Across America, special editions of magazines and newspapers were sold to commemorate his life and times, and there were all sorts of panel discussions about him on TV.
Coming from the global south, of course, he was very interested in issues of justice and peace.
Most networks, likewise, featured extensive coverage of his funeral, which was held in Rome on April 26th. Many world leaders were in attendance, including President Trump and President Zelensky of Ukraine, and they had a little chat off to the side at one point, creating what is almost certainly the most iconic photograph of the Sede Vacante era. Other photos were decidedly less celebrated, including the apparently high number of selfies that people were taking in front of the Pope's coffin. The mourning of Pope Francis was not without nuance, of course. Within the formal Catholic Church hierarchy of priests and bishops, Francis was said to be a somewhat contentious figure because he was associated with the church's more liberal wing, and he often did things, mostly small symbolic gestures, that offended conservatives and traditionalists. In the New York Times, the conservative Catholic columnist Ross Douthat said that the divisive character of Francis's reign had resulted in a weakening of the office of Pope overall, but he also noted that this could be a good thing. People aren't suddenly becoming Catholic because of things the Pope has done or said, but they also aren't rejecting Catholicism because they reject papal edicts or desire doctrinal change. Instead, the manifest weakness of Catholicism as an institution, the breakdown of lines of authority and deference, has seemingly made it easier for some people to consider Catholicism as a religion, a way of life, and to find their small doorway in. In any case, this idea of Francis as an ideologically divisive figure loomed large in the other great media trend of Sede Vacante 2025, which was endless speculation on how the race to replace him might go. Even though attempts to predict Pope elections are notoriously inaccurate, there is always a great deal of public demand for the media to treat the conclaves of cardinals that pick popes as being basically political bodies that are making a basically political decision according to political logic. Thus, media around the world obediently churned out lists of supposed papal frontrunners sorted into liberal and conservative columns.
Peter Erdo from Hungary, maybe on the more conservative side. Luis Tagle from the Philippines, maybe more on the progressive side.
The fact that the movie Conclave had come out just a year earlier as well doubtless played a large role in the amount of speculation as well. The film portrays Vatican culture at its most devious, and there was a lot of talk during Sede Vacante 2025 about the degree that it was an accurate representation of what was likely to go down in the race to replace Francis.
This is a conclave, Aldo. It's not a war.
It is a war. And you have to commit to a side.
But let us now cast our scope outward a bit. What else defined the Sede Vacante 2025 era, other than speculation about the papacy itself? President Trump officially passed his 100th day in office on April 29th, 2025. This is a landmark moment in US political culture that is traditionally treated as an opportunity to reflect on how the president has been doing so far. And I think it is safe to say that Trump mostly got bad grades on this front. Trump's 100th day came after 3 months of pretty chaotic governance, defined in large part by Trump's wild and inconsistent efforts to impose dramatic tariffs on all foreign goods imported into the United States. The struggle of American businesses to adapt to these new tariffs, coupled with the looming threat of higher prices for consumer goods, made fear of an imminent recession one of the defining themes of the Sede Vacante era. On social media, people were even reviving the idea of a recession core aesthetic, defined by cheap food, furniture, and fashion. Here is how the New Yorker's John Cassidy reported on the situation in an April 28th article. Practically everywhere, confusion reigns, and no wonder. The degree of chaos and uncertainty that has been unleashed upon the US economy and the world economy is unprecedented. Eswar Prasad, a Cornell University economist and former senior official at the International Monetary Fund, told me. There have been other administrations that have come to office and had to deal with instability early on, but the fact that this administration comes in and its own policies are what stoked instability is quite remarkable. On April 27th, a very damaging poll came out showing that Trump had the highest 100-day disapproval rating of any president in 80 years. In other words, he was enjoying basically none of the sort of goodwill that voters traditionally tend to give to a president when he's just starting out. And for his part, Trump did very little to make things better. A string of interviews with the president were released to coincide with his 100th day, including Time Magazine, The Atlantic, and ABC News, and all of them were widely panned as embarrassing, if not slightly incoherent.
It says MS-13.
That was Photoshop.
That was Photoshop. Terry, you can't do that.
Trump obviously still has a lot of time left in his second term, but whatever else he gets up to, the sede vacante era will definitely not be seen as a high point of his tenure. Trump's unpopularity during this era was also notable for affecting the perception of two of the most closely watched international elections of sede vacante 2025. Canada and Australia, both countries re-elected their center-left ruling parties to power for another term, following campaigns that were widely portrayed, especially in the international media, as referendums on what voters in those countries thought about their relationship, not just with Trump the man, but also Trump-style right-wing populism in general. Maybe my perspective is a little biased as a Canadian, but I definitely feel like Prime Minister Mark Carney really emerged as one of the great progressive heroes of this era, especially among liberals in the US. His whole brand as a politician was based around his ability to offer resistance to Trump, which really made him a sort of symbol that a lot of people were looking for at the time. A May 6th meeting between the two men in the Oval Office, in which Carney seemed calm and unflappable in the face of Trump's provocations, only helped him consolidate this reputation further.
We had Mark Carney coming down to meet Donald Trump in the Oval Office.
Crushed
And
it.
I don't know if you guys caught this,
Crushed it.
but he absolutely owned Trump.
At least two other major world leaders assumed office during sede vacante 2025. The South Korean presidency has been bouncing all over the place since the impeachment of former President Yoon Suk-yeol in December of 2024. After his failed attempt to impose martial law. On May 2nd, Korea's fourth consecutive acting president, Lee Joo-ho, came to power for complicated succession reasons I won't get into here. Given that the next Korean presidential election is set for June the 3rd, being in office during the sede vacante period, and then offering official congratulations to the new pope, might wind up being the highlights of Mr. Lee's brief presidency. 4 days later, on May the 6th, the German parliament did what was widely expected and elected Friedrich Merz to be the new chancellor. Merz's Conservative Party had won the German national election back in February, unseating the Social Democrats, but German parliamentary negotiations tend to ramble on for months before a new chancellor can be formally installed. Merz actually failed to win a majority in the first round of voting, which was a huge embarrassment for him, as nothing like that had ever happened in the entire history of post-war German democracy. On April 23rd, there was a massacre of Indian tourists by Pakistani terrorists in the disputed Kashmir province that borders the two countries. On May 7th, India began what they called Operation Sindoor, launching missile attacks against Pakistani targets, and Pakistan immediately struck back. It was immediately characterized as the latest of the many canonical wars between India and Pakistan. A ceasefire was announced on May 10th, and as I film this, it still seems to be holding. And if it does, that would mean that the 2025 India-Pakistan conflict was almost entirely a sede vacante era thing. But it is still too early to tell. All right, now moving outside of politics, what else can we say defined the vibe of sede vacante 2025? So, if we look at the Billboard Top 100 for the most popular singles of the sede vacante period, we can observe a pretty clear musical trend. The hottest songs during this era tended towards the slow-paced, tender, romantic, and emotional. The number one chart topper for all 3 weeks of sede vacante was Luther by Kendrick Lamar and SZA.
This world.
Ruined It Out by Alex Warren's Ordinary, Drake's Nokia, Shabuzi's Bar Song, and the Lady Gaga and Bruno Mars collab Die With A Smile. All of which had a similar sort of wistful energy to them. The only exception to this would maybe be Pink Pony Club by Chappell Roan, which remained quite popular during this era, as it had been for weeks prior. That one is a bit faster paced, but still quite emotionally heavy. Melancholic music is one of the few examples of a cultural trend of the Sette Vacante era, where you could make a connection between the vibe and the fact that we were going through a period of official mourning. I mean, obviously, there's no actual connection between these two things. American musical tastes had been drifting towards slower, more tender songs for a while now. But still, I'm sure Pope Francis would be happy to know that we weren't all jamming out to high-octane club music right after his death. You can check out my Sette Vacante 2025 playlist in the description. Movies are like the perfect cultural product to define a Sette Vacante era, because they tend to make the most money and enjoy the most hype in the first 2 weeks after their release. In a deliciously ironic twist, the most popular movie of the Sette Vacante 2025 era was a film called Sinners. It came out just 3 days before the Pope died and immediately jumped to the top of the box office charts, where it stayed for 2 weeks. What made the success of Sinners feel uniquely culturally significant was that it was a completely original story at a time when most Hollywood blockbusters are based on some pre-existing franchise. It was directed by Ryan Coogler, and like all of his movies, it starred Michael B. Jordan, this time playing two twin brothers living in the segregated South in a world in which vampires also exist. The film was broadly acclaimed by both critics and audiences as a creative, mature movie that took seriously the question of how the presence of supernatural forces might alter and complicate a real-world era of American history. As Dana Stevens wrote in her review for Slate, Coogler is undertaking nothing less than an allegory about the Great Migration of the early 20th century, the flowering of the blues as an art form in both Chicago and the Delta region, and the mass trauma imposed by generations of Jim Crow laws and the constant threat of Ku Klux Klan violence. If that makes Sinners sound like a talky thought experiment, rather than the raucous crowd pleaser it is, note that these heady themes are interwoven with abundant jump scares, vampire smackdowns, and surprisingly frank sex scenes. In the final week of Sette Vacante, however, Sinners was dethroned from the top of the box office charts by Thunderbolts, yet another movie set in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's probably worth noting that Sinners itself displaced the Minecraft movie, so we can say that Sette Vacante 2025 was truly an era in which audiences were prepared to reward original, creative, risk-taking filmmaking. Of course, that being said, one of the other big cinematic events of the No Pope era was the April 25th re-release of Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, on the 20th anniversary of its original 2005 release. Widely regarded as the best film of the otherwise notorious Star Wars prequel era, Revenge of the Sith has become an increasing object of millennial and zoomer nostalgia as it emerges as a defining symbol of 2000s pop culture. Sentimentality for 2000s era culture was a pretty defining characteristic of Sette Vacante 2025 overall, from the reemergence of Recession Core to the return of Lady Gaga to the Billboard charts to the next thing that we are going to discuss. On April 22nd, the company Bethesda released a remake of their hit 2006 game Oblivion, known as Oblivion Remastered, for all of the big gaming platforms. This was an event of extraordinary nostalgic delight for the many men in their 20s and 30s who had grown up playing the original game on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. The remaster itself leaned into all of this very consciously, keeping in many of the bugs and glitches and other moments of weirdness that had become so heavily sentimentalized over the last 20 years. As Travis Northrop put it in his April 29th review for IGN, it's one of those situations where everything looks like I fondly remember it, instead of how it actually did back in 2006. Oblivion quickly jumped to the top of the Steam sales charts and stayed there for weeks, definitely making it the signature gaming experience of the hopeless era. I'm not much of a sportsman, but I think it's not too difficult to argue that Sette Vacante 2025 contained more than a few significant moments in American professional sports culture. The NHL 2025 playoffs had kicked off just a few days before Pope Francis died. From a Canadian perspective, the Sede Vacante period was notable for containing the rare phenomenon known as the Battle for Ontario, which is when the two Ontario teams, the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Ottawa Senators, face off head-to-head in the Eastern Teams division. It had been over 20 years since the last Battle of Ontario, and this one spanned 6 games from April 20th to May 1st, with Toronto triumphing 4-2. The first round of the NHL playoffs were a good time for Canada overall, given that by May 4th, 3 Canadian teams had advanced to the second bracket for the first time since 2004. So truly a golden era for Canadian hockey. Over in football world, meanwhile, the Sede Vacante period overlapped with the NFL draft. On April 24th, Shedeur Sanders, the son of Deion Sanders, was pranked with a fake draft call.
But you're gonna have to wait a little bit longer, man.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Ready to go! What does that mean?
It was one of the most dramatic pranks in the history of modern American professional sports, just given how much security the NFL tends to put around these things. On May 5th, meanwhile, the career of star player Justin Tucker of the Baltimore Ravens, one of the greatest kickers in football history, came to an ignoble close after he was fired in the wake of allegations that he had sexually harassed multiple massage therapists. So that's certainly the end of his era. The fashion highlight of the Sede Vacante era was definitely the May 5th gala at the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art. There were some real wild outfits at this one, like Andre 3000 with the piano on his back, and Janelle Monáe dressed as what appears to be some version of the Monopoly Man, but also a lot of so-called naked dresses that showed off a ton of skin. I don't know if this particular trend is going to be falling out anytime soon, but if it does, the 2025 Met Gala will definitely be seen as a high point of it. Skype, Microsoft's once omnipresent video calling app, officially shut down on May the 5th as they sought to move everyone over to their other communication app, Microsoft Teams. This had been a long time coming, but it was hard not to feel a little bit sentimental about its passing, given just how revolutionary it had seemed when it first debuted in 2003. Undeniably, the defining meme of Sede Vacante 2025 was the 1 gorilla versus 100 men question. At the time of the Pope's death, a viral debate had broken out online.
Huge debate going online right now. Who would win in a fight? 100 men
versus a single gorilla.
All over TikTok and other social media sites, people were yammering on and on about this, making videos and skits and memes and AI art, and just generally treating the absurd premise as a deep and fascinating topic in the usual fashion of these sorts of things. Even Mr. Beast got into it. And just barely squeezing into the Sede Vacante period was the shocking release of Kanye West's most deranged provocation yet, a pro-Nazi song called Hail Hitler, which he posted in the early morning of May the 8th, the day that the new Pope was elected. Kanye is by any standard, deeply unwell. And let's hope that this is the lowest he ever goes. His timing was particularly morbid, given that it occurred on the same day that the Europeans were honoring the 80th anniversary of the Nazi surrender of May 8th, 1945. King Charles of Britain, President Macron of France, and new German Chancellor Merz all attended dignified ceremonies to celebrate the end of the war against fascism. Although many European leaders also made a point of emphasizing that war, hate, and the totalitarian ambition have not, in fact, been fully vanquished and remain very active enemies of the modern free world. All right, so what was the point of this video? I am not Catholic, so the period between two popes was of no particular personal significance to me, but I was still fascinated by it as a unique and highly observable period of history. And I just think it can be interesting to use unique historical moments like this as an opportunity to practice a certain sort of mindfulness about the world around you. It's easy to reflect on long periods of history, or even of your own life, just because there's so much to work with. Attempting to analyze a brief era, by contrast, takes a lot more effort just because it passes by so quickly. But if you keep your eyes open, you can notice that quite a lot can happen in just 2 or 3 weeks, including things that may impact society, culture, or even you yourself for a long time to come. When you give yourself permission to slow down and pay attention, you never know what you might find. So I'd be curious to know if there are any defining things or events of the era of Sede Vacante 2025 that you think I missed. What will Sede Vacante 2025 mean to you? Decades from now, what will you feel the most nostalgic about when you look back at this pivotal era of the past with a heart full of sentimental longing? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you next week, hopefully with no more green screen.